Hello, everybody. Hi. We're just gonna give it a couple of minutes to let people join. Hi, everyone. Okay, I think James and Daisy, if you can just keep an eye on the waiting room as people filter in, but I think we can get started. So hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us and taking an hour out of your day to join this session. Especially, we were just saying it's a really nice sunny lunchtime, so we're very grateful for you spending it with us to talk about governance. So for anyone that doesn't know me, I'm Nicole and I'm the certification manager at B UK. I work in the growth and product team, and our team works with companies exactly like yourselves who are in the process of going through the B Corp certification journey. And this is the first in a series of webinars that we're hosting over the next few months, where we'll be talking about each impact area within the BIA. And we focus these sessions for companies like yourselves who are in the evaluation queue. And the reasoning for that really is that we know there is a bit of a wait period in between completing the assessment and starting that more in-depth verification process. So we really want to make sure that you can use this time to keep thinking about your impact, things you can be improving on, and also to share some really great stories from B Corps who are doing great things in all different impact areas. So we will be running these sessions in the future kind of on a monthly basis. And we're starting with governance today. So this is kind of the guinea pig session. And we'd love to hear kind of feedback from you at the end as to whether these kinds of sessions are useful and anything that you'd like to see out of them in the future. So if we can move along to the next slide. In terms of the agenda for today, so we'll start with a bit of an overview of the governance impact area within the BIA. So what are the kinds of topics that are covered there? And kind of going into some more detail about areas that could be interesting areas to focus on if you're still thinking about making improvements during this time. We're then also joined by two fantastic speakers from two different B Corps, which is great. So we're joined by Sung-Hyui, who is a senior associate at Bateswells. So for those of you who don't know, Bateswells are really closely involved with the development of the legal requirement in the UK. So it's great to have them here to kind of talk a bit more about what that legal requirement actually looks like in practice for a business. And then we also have Amanda Powell-Smith, who's the chief executive at Forster Communications. Forster have been winners of the B Corp Best for the World in the governance section for several years in a row. So they've got lots of really amazing stories to share about what good governance looks like to them. So hopefully it will be a really interesting opportunity to learn from those two different companies and just kind of bring the governance section to life a little bit. And then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. Great to see lots of people already messaging in the chat, which is great. And then just to touch on a few housekeeping quick things. So we're recording this webinar and we'll be able to share the recording and the slides with all of you afterwards. If you could please just keep yourself on mute during the presentations. And if you have any questions, you can just drop them in the chat and the team will try and answer as many of those as we can in the chat. But if there's anything we can't quite cover, feel free to just kind of unmute yourself during the Q&A session at the end and we'll have some time for that as well. Great. So I think diving straight into the first section, so talking really about what the governance section is within the impact assessment. So governance is the first section that appears in the BIA. And as you all know from going through this process already, you don't have to complete the BIA in order and you can jump between sections, but governance really underpins the practices of a company. So it's a really good place to start if you're thinking about potential areas for improvement. So just going on to the next slide, please. So there's kind of 4 main sections in the governance impact area. The first one is mission and engagement. And the questions in this section are really looking at, does the company have a mission? Does that mission contain some kind of commitment to a social or environmental cause? And then it looks at how that mission and social and environmental responsibility is built into the business in a formal way. So, for example, do managers or employees have KPIs or individual objectives related to social and environmental performance? Is there compensation linked to that performance? Is there training for employees on these kinds of topics? So really kind of focused on the theme of embedding that social and environmental responsibility into all different levels of the business. The second subsection is ethics and transparency. And this section is really looking at kind of protections against ethical misconduct within the company. And it really looks at different policies and practices that the company might have in place. So, for example, if the company has a code of conduct or a code of ethics, and how that company communicates those policies to employees, and what the kind of the behavioral expectations are of the company. So it's really about kind of not just having these policies in place, but actually how embedded they are in the culture of that company. And then financial practices also kind of come into play here. There are questions around transparency, so how much of the company's information is made transparent, whether that's around company ownership or the makeup of the board, the financial performance of the company, and impact reports and things like that. So quite broad-ranging set of questions in that section as well. And then moving on to governance metrics. So this is a completely unscored question in the assessment, but it asks really important questions. So it will ask questions about the company's income and revenue for the last fiscal year and also the year before that. So even though the section is unscored, it's really significant because these questions are used as reference points in other parts of the assessment, particularly the revenue last year question is really crucial to earning points if you've opted into any impact business models in other areas of the assessment. So we'd recommend just kind of double checking that you've inputted the correct information there and that that's up to date, because it's something that is kind of constantly looked at during the verification process. And then finally, mission locked. So we're going to talk a lot about this in other later sections of this webinar. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it now, but essentially this is the part of the assessment where we recognise the amendment to a company's Articles of Association. It's worth up to 10 points, so it's a big question in the BIA, and it's really focused around this legal amendment to the company's articles and the company committing to sign the B Corp agreement. So this next section is a few tips on areas that you could focus on if you're looking at improving your score whilst you're waiting to be verified. And just to say here that all companies will see slightly different versions of the assessment depending on which track they're on. So not all of these things will be relevant for everyone, but they're just some areas that we found companies can work on in a relatively short period of time, and they kind of require relatively low resource or effort compared to some of the other kind of larger, more structural changes that businesses might be interested in undertaking. So just to pick up on some of these here. So the first one is obviously the mission lock. As I mentioned, I'm going to let Daisy and Sung-Hyui talk much more about this in a moment, so I won't dwell on this one. But all B Corps will be required to make that legal commitment at some stage on their certification journey. So it's really worth doing early if you can to get those extra points as part of the certification. And then around social and environmental decision making, if the company has a board of directors, you can set it up so that at least once a year there is a board meeting which includes an update on social and environmental performance. And that's something that can be implemented relatively quickly and is really about kind of bringing those social and environmental issues up to the board level and making them part of the regular conversations that the company is having. Code of ethics. So if you don't have one, you can put one in place. And here we're kind of calling out lots of different policies that can be part of that code of ethics. And it's important when you're thinking about these things, really, to be thinking about implementing things that are in line with the company's values and things they believe in. So it's really more than a box ticking exercise, and it's something that should be implemented because the company really believes it's the right thing to do. But once these kinds of things are written up into a code of ethics, it's about making sure that that's really accessible to employees. It's in a place where employees can access it easily, doesn't just kind of sit in a shared drive or a folder and not get looked at. It's really about kind of embedding that into the company. So yeah, if you do want to implement a code of ethics, it can include some of these things that are called out on the slide here. And yes, we will share these slides after the session as well. And then the next few are quite self-explanatory, really. So sharing financial updates with employees. This is around making sure employees are really updated and engaged on the financial performance of the company. And it doesn't have to be anything kind of too kind of intensive to set up. It can be during company presentations, just sharing information about financial performance of the company, budgeting, that kind of thing. You could also write and circulate a whistleblower policy, and it can include these things called out on the slide around providing an anonymous mechanism for employees to report any concerns that they might have, a confidentiality policy, things like that. And then finally, a conflict of interest questionnaire. So going back to the board of directors, if that's something that you have within the company, you could ask them to complete a conflict of interest questionnaire and make this something that happens annually. So these are just a few suggestions of areas where we found from experience that companies can focus on with relatively low effort. So if this is a time where you're still looking to be improving on your impact whilst you're in the evaluation queue stage, hopefully there's some useful food for thought in there for you. Great, so I'm going to pass over to Daisy now to talk a bit about the impact business model for this section and the legal change. So over to you, Daisy.
Great, thank you, Nicole. Just to introduce myself, my name is Daisy. I'm a business sustainability analyst at B-Lab UK. So my role is during the review process. I look at the evaluation stage of the assessment. So the first kind of part of the review process, I'm the person who will initially take a high-level look at your assessment. So we just really wanted to briefly outline the mission lock requirement here, and then go on to tell you about each option that's available in the mission lock question, because often this is misunderstood by companies and often can lead to a score drop during the evaluation chain stage. So yeah, we just wanted to give you an overview before we pass over to Bateswells. So essentially, the mission lock requirement is an amendment to the company's governing documents. So this is usually the Articles of Association for UK companies. And this reflects a commitment to create a material positive impact on society and the environment, and also make sure that companies consider all stakeholder interests, not only shareholders, as in kind of the traditional Companies Act. So the two main benefits to this are that it empowers businesses to pursue non-financial objectives and also make mission-aligned decisions over time. This is especially important when protecting the mission, for example, in the case that a business is sold or having other structural changes like a change of ownership. This really helps to protect the mission. So as I mentioned, I'm just going to go through the different answer options for the mission lock question. Just to mention, we use these terms interchangeably. So mission lock, legal requirement, or legal test. You might hear us talking about these different things, but they are kind of interchangeable phrases. So just to go through one by one, so starting with option 1. This represents a company that has not yet made the legal requirement, but they have made the commitment to make the legal requirement. So, for example, at the end of the certification process, companies will have to sign the B Corp agreement if they have more than 50 employees And this commits them to making the legal change during the first year of their certification term. So this often awards 2.5 points, depending on the track of the assessment that you're on. But just to be really clear, for companies that have less than 50 employees, this wouldn't meet the minimum requirement that they would need in order to pass on from the evaluation stage to the later stages of the assessment. So you can select option 1 kind of whilst you're going through the assessment. If you have less than 50 employees, use it to kind of have a measured score, so a slightly kind of underestimated score. And then once you've implemented your legal change and amended your articles of association, then you can uplift yourself to option 4, which we'll talk about in a few slides' time. So moving on to option 2, this is specifically designed in the UK for cooperatives. So this is the most common kind of legal form that option 2 would apply to. So this means that companies have a legal structure that naturally preserves mission over time. So for example, a worker-owned cooperative. And just to mention, this is quite rare and unusual, and quite often companies kind of accidentally select this option when they actually mean to select another one. And just a note on cooperatives as well, they can be incorporated or unincorporated. They kind of can take different legal forms, which I'm sure Bateswells would have more knowledge on if you had specific questions. But if a cooperative is incorporated and they have articles of association, this means that they could actually gain the full 10 points and select option 4 if they make the legal requirement. And we'd always recommend companies to kind of go for the highest level of legal commitment that you possibly can, not only because it uplifts your score, but because it really embeds the mission and B Corp certification requirements are met kind of to the highest level. So moving on to option 3, this is specifically designed for companies that are wholly owned subsidiaries that are complete and distinct from their parent entity. And this means that the wholly owned subsidiary can go through B Corp certification independent of their parent company. This means that they can't receive the full credit for mission log because the legal requirement has been made at kind of their wholly owned subsidiary level, but it hasn't been made at the highest level of governance at the parent company level. So if the parent company went on to certify after the subsidiary, then potentially they could raise up to option 4 later on. So finally, talking about option 4, so this is basically like the ideal scenario. So this is when a company has already made the legal commitment, they've amended their articles of association ahead of certification, which is fantastic. Like Nicole mentioned, we always encourage companies to kind of go for the legal change as soon as possible, not only for the points lift, but to preserve the mission. So just to clarify between the different sizes of companies, all companies that are less than 50 employees in size should aim to have completed this legal requirement and be ticking this option 4 box before they reach the evaluation stage of the assessment. And to explain why this is, basically at the evaluation stage of the review process, this is when we have to check that the company has met all of the eligibility and certification requirements and that they're basically ready to go to become a B Corp and be verified. So if a company has less than 50 employees and they haven't made the legal requirement, like at the stage that they reach evaluation, we would have a conversation with them to kind of guide them on how to make this change and find out what their timelines are. And if they had like an imminent timeline, so say their articles are going to be with Companies House in the next 2 weeks, then that would be okay. And they could go through to the verification queue and then provide the evidence as soon as possible. Just to mention, we also encourage larger companies to get to option 4 as soon as possible if they can and make the legal commitment. But if companies more than 50 employees kind of haven't reached this stage by the time they reach evaluation, they often kind of get switched from option 4 to option 1. So that is quite a significant drop in points. But then they can make the legal change after certification because they have the extra year because they're a larger business to do that. And as long as they're above 80 points after the evaluation stage, then they can proceed to verification with option 1. So hopefully that was clear. I know it's a lot of information. Let's move on to option 5. So this is none of the above. So we often do see companies reaching the evaluation stage having selected this none of the above option. And just to kind of be blunt, companies that are at this situation with none of the above, once they reach evaluation stage, they won't be able to pass on to later stages of the assessment. So if it's a small company, we'd guide them through how to make the legal change. And if it's a larger company, we'd talk them through the commitment that they would be making anyway by signing the B Corp agreement when they certify, and therefore they could be changed to option 1. So I would say the only time that we'd recommend that you use the none of the above option would be if you want to kind of measure your score and reach 80 without the mission lock points being included. And then later on, you can have that uplift once you've made the legal change and you can add in those mission lock points to your assessment. Okay, so just one slide on how to make the legal change and then we'll pass over to Bates-Wells. So just to give you a brief overview on how you do this in practice, you would need to pass a special resolution with 75% of shareholders agreeing to amend the articles. And then these amended articles would need to be filed with Companies House. There is a kind of legal text document that we have, which is linked on this slide, and we'll send the slides around afterwards, which has some recommended wording, which has been agreed to be kind of sufficient to meet the legal requirement. And this recommended wording should be included in the articles. And just to reiterate the timelines, so companies with less than 50 employees do have to meet the legal requirement before they can be certified. And companies with more than 50 employees can gain certification, but they have to make the commitment to make the legal change 1 year after certifying. So I'll pass back to Nicole to introduce Bates-Wells.
Great, thanks so much, Daisy. I know we're kind of flying through with lots of information here, so if anyone has any questions, do drop them in the chat and we'll respond to them. But yeah, that's a great segue into the next section from Bates-Wells. So I'll pass over to Sung-Hyui, who will now take us through kind of what the legal requirement actually really means for a business and some advice for any companies that are thinking about going through that process.
Great, thank you very much, Nicole, and good afternoon, everyone. Just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Sung-Hyui Park. I'm a senior associate within the Impact Economy team at Bates-Wells, and I regularly advise existing and prospective B Corps in relation to the UK legal test incorporation, what it means for directors' duties, and also advising on a range of B Corps implementing their values through, for example, how they write their contracts, how they write their policies, and how they receive investment, etc. So it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and thank you so much to B Lab UK for inviting us. So in relation to my bit, as mentioned in the summary section, we will be looking basically at two things. I know it's 3 points here, but we'll run through the main elements from a governance perspective of the UK legal test, and also looking at some of the ways this plays out in practice, because I'm sure that that will be what you are interested in rather than the kind of more dry legal wording itself in the legislation and in your articles. So we'll go through those, and rather than dealing with those separately, I've sought to kind of incorporate them within my these kind of questions within my presentation, but very happy to discuss and answer any questions you have as we're going through. Next slide, please. Okay, and so we'll start off with the UK legal test. And here I thought, before we kind of go on to what the UK legal test means for B Corps, I thought it would be good to introduce the topic by recapping quickly on what the default position is for UK companies generally. So there's a chunky bit of Companies Act section 1721, and here it says a director of the company must act in the way that they consider to promote the success of the company for the benefit of its members as a whole. And we've underlined that as that is kind of the crucial bit. And in doing so, they'll have regard to a variety of factors, including, it's listed there, things like employees, business relationship with suppliers and customers, the local community, the environment, etc. But the wording for that is quite fundamental in what the implications are, because what it means is that for the directors of non-B Corps, you do take these wider considerations into account, but when push comes to shove, if any of them conflict with the interests of the shareholders, and that often, but not always, means profit maximization for shareholders, then the shareholders' interests come first, and that's a notion of shareholder primacy, and that is a default position if you're not a B Corp. So I thought that would kind of set the scene, and to contrast, we then go on to what is a B Corp. So next slide, please. So just before we go on to what it means to be a B Corp, being a B Corp means that you move away from that shareholder primacy perspective and approach. And we sometimes do get asked whether we are actually allowed to do that under company law, or whether it would be a breach of company law to move away from that. And if you ever get asked that question, or if you have that question yourself, section 1722 states that where you have purposes of the company that are other than for the benefit of its members, then those other purposes will take precedence. So this is a stopgap to show that you don't have to do the shareholder primacy model first under UK law. You can have a different approach if you embed that in your articles. So that kind of gives the context for the next bit, which is the UK legal test. So this is kind of getting into a little bit more detail as to what was just shared before. And there, the things that are highlighted are basically what will be in your articles if you incorporate the mission log and the UK legal test. So there it says that the objects and the purpose of the company are to promote the success of the company for the benefit of its members as a whole, which we've touched upon before for the default position, and through its business and operations, to have a material positive impact on society and the environment as a whole. So that is your triple bottom line fundamental wording that says you're not putting profit maximization or shareholders first. You have people, profit and planet kind of having equal standing, and that's why you're different in becoming a B Corp. And then section 2 has the wording that we saw before in the context of the default position, but these are talking about the range of shareholders and stakeholders whose interests that you are taking into account while considering this kind of broader triple bottom line philosophy to being a B Corp. Next slide, please. So that sets the scene from a legal perspective of how your director's duties change when you are not a B Corp to becoming a B Corp. And then we look at a few kind of scenarios in practice about what that means for your business. So next slide, please. So firstly, as we've already said, when you become a B Corp, from a governance perspective, shareholders' interests are no longer paramount. So directors are not required to put shareholders' interests ahead of other interests. And the goal here is to be an overall positive impact among the different relevant stakeholder groups. So what does that mean? So if we drill into that a little bit further, so there are written core business and operations versus ancillary versus CSR activities. So there, if you are a B Corp, the kind of positive impact that you're trying to achieve needs to be meaningful and implemented through your core activities, your business activities, and all the different ways in which you operate, which you are probably now all familiar with through having done the BIA, rather than kind of more tokenistic, ancillary CSR type activities. And in implementing this, to go to the next point, the type of strategies that the directors should be pursuing will obviously depend on a case-by-case basis, but a practical factor is that the directors need to think whether in the long term, what they are pursuing is creating a positive impact for a particular stakeholder group, which could be customers or suppliers or the environment or the community, at the significant expense of one or other stakeholder groups. So there, it's not shareholder first, but then neither is it another particular group first either. It is that balancing of the three different types of groups that we've talked about. So there is a balancing act, and that is a high level factor for the directors to consider. And then another kind of question that we get asked in terms of practicalities is, what if there has been a particular year where, for example, because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the enormous financial burden this has placed on companies, a company feels like it hasn't achieved a material positive impact in a particular year? Is this going to be completely detrimental and severely impact its ability to continue operating as a B Corp? And the answer there is that the directors won't necessarily be in breach of their duties in this situation, as long as they, in good faith and in accordance with their kind of other general directors' duties to act in a way that is fulfilling their duties of skill and care, etc. So as long as they have acted in that year so that the strategy and the activities of the group were directed towards the aim of achieving a positive material impact, then it's fine if you don't quite get there in a particular year, as long as there is a reasonable prospect that this will be achieved in time. And another part of the UK legal test, which I won't go into too much detail because we're focusing on governance here, is on your annual impact reporting. And there you would talk about what you have sought to do to achieve your impact goals and what you have actually done and how you measure against those. So there will be a degree of accountability and disclosure there, but it is not critical if you haven't met a specific set of goals in relation to positive impact, as long as you have tried and you do have that long-term strategy in place. Next slide, please. So I'm conscious of time, so I'll move very quickly forward to liability to third parties. So another governance question we get asked quite a lot is, if you are a B Corp and you have to take into account these wider considerations of the environment and communities and customers, etc., does that mean that your scope of liability as a director becomes bigger once you become a B Corp to these other groups? And the answer, to be short, is no. There is no additional liability. There is that wording here, which we've copied and pasted from the legal test. And we deliberately put this wording to address this particular concern. So you probably have a, sorry, I had a question there from Julie Morris. What is meant by material issues? Julie, if that's okay, I come back to your question and maybe you can have a chat about in terms of what you mean by the material issues element. But in relation to liability, although the directors have to consider the interests of those beyond the shareholders, then those entities and those parties cannot actually bring a direct kind of claim against the directors in relation to owing a duty of care to them. So if you have the shareholders, for example, as a specific group saying, well, we don't think you have put us first enough, and therefore we will bring an action against you. It is technically possible for the shareholders to bring an action against the directors on behalf of the company. But then if they did that, then it would have to go through the courts, and the courts would review what the directors have done on the basis of this new triple bottom line test, which is about 3 different limbs. I don't think, unless Nicole and the other B Lab team members say differently, I don't think I'm aware of any specific occasion where claims have been brought against a company by the shareholders for this. But that is a kind of practical point where directors should actually feel empowered rather than worried about kind of enforcing the triple bottom line test. I think previously, under the default position, you had a concern that directors couldn't take into account these wider factors, otherwise they might have a claim brought against them by the shareholders. but by having the UK legal test embedded, they should feel empowered that they're able to take decisions that take into account a wider range of factors. So next slide, please. Okay, so I'll be very quick and we can discuss more later in the Q&A section in relation to specific scenarios. But if I just whiz through a few other scenarios where practically the director's duties and governance may play a part. One is in relationships with subsidiaries. This was touched upon before, but if you are a certified B Corp and you have your own subsidiaries who themselves are not becoming certified B Corps, then it does actually impact the way your subsidiaries operate, because they have a duty to operate in the interests of their shareholder, which is you as the parent. So even if they are not directly B Corps, the fact that you are a B Corp will impact the way that they operate to take that into account, because they have to put you first as a shareholder. In relation to JVs, franchisees, and your relationship with third parties, we would anticipate that you would review your arrangements with them to make sure that the terms of those contracts and agreements reflect your values as a B Corp. So it may be the case where you review all of those arrangements to see them with a B Corp lens. And in terms of taking on new investment and future exits, when you are taking on investment, either from an equity or from a debt perspective, you may have pressure put on you from your investors to put in certain terms, to cut certain costs, or to have a specific exit strategy to maximize returns to the investors. But you will need to take into account that triple bottom line approach in pushing back or negotiating those demands. And from an exit perspective, as was alluded to before, this is particularly potent because you are not looking at, if you're thinking about selling your B Corp business, you're not necessarily going to sell to the highest bidder, which would be in the interest of the shareholders, because you would have to think about, for example, what the impact on the employees of your company might be, the social and environmental credentials, your proposed buyers, and what their purpose for your company will be following the sale. So in some ways, there may be a kind of a practical impact of not getting as high a price as perhaps you wanted to if you were pursuing kind of a profit first approach. But then it is about safeguarding the mission of your company and reflecting that in the way that you deal with a variety of things, including sales. And being an impactful company may actually open your company up to being attractive to impact investors or those who have a responsible way of conducting their investment work. So it could open you up to potentially new buyers as well. So I think that is it. I am conscious that I've run over slightly, so apologies for that. But if there are any questions, I'm very happy to take them after the Forster's presentation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sung-Hyui. I see there are a couple of questions in the chat, so it would be great to come back to those at the end. I'm sure we'll have at least 10 minutes for Q&A, so we can definitely pick those up. And yeah, what a great way to set the scene for Amanda from Forster, who is going to talk about kind of what all of these principles of good governance look like within Forster Communications. So over to you, Amanda.
Lovely, thank you very much, and for giving us a chance to be here. So yes, we're a founding UK B Corp, and we have been recertified 3 times. So been through it a bit. Delighted to be best for the world in governance, and happy to answer any questions as we go through and afterwards. But perhaps if you could, new slide, please. And another new slide, done that one. So just really, I almost wanted to start it by doing a bit of a cheerlead for governance. It's quite often seen as a really boring topic, but actually it's so important. I think has just been explained, the mission lock and everything you do. It's really, I think, the only mechanism that we've got as business leaders to really lock in change at the core of what we're doing, so it's rising profile with ESG, but the E and S quite often get most of the chat. Actually, I think the G bit is really, really critical. So wanted to kick off with that as a starting point, and then really talk about us. So we are all around communications for positive change, and so our purpose as an organisation is using the power of communications to protect and improve lives. That's how we were set up as a business. It's and therefore it has always been there as in informing and directing what we do and how we operate. operate as a business. So literally how we run ourselves through to the clients that we take on is asking the question about, are we going to be making a positive social and environmental impact as a result of the work we do? So we had already been doing impact reports pre-becoming a B Corp in 2015, but by becoming a B Corp, it was a very important step to then move into, if you like, independent measurement and validation from a trusted third party about what we were doing, which is why we then chose to do that. And our B Corp metrics are firmly on the board agenda. Every time we meet, they're locked into our risk and opportunities report. They're always firmly discussed. So the whole sort of paperwork trail is there, but so is the discussion about what we're doing. And for us, it's about leaning in and what do we need to do next. There's quite a few other logos on this slide: Living Wage, SME Climate Hub, Race to Zero, etc. We do use other initiatives to complement and support our B Corp status, partly because they make us keep thinking about what's next, but also actually in reversing, by doing other initiatives, whether that's being a member of the Living Wage campaign, that then reinforces our B Corp commitments, and so it helps add back into the proof of what we're doing. Make My Money Matter is a really interesting one. It's quite new. In fact, we were introduced to that through B Corp, and that's the sort of great conversations that we all have. It's a really important reflection that actually in tracking carbon change, the vast majority of our impacts come through our scope 3 emissions in finance and pensions, and that actually seeing that written down and measured it was quite shocking, even though we know these things. So by joining Make My Money Matter, and then that's led to a series of activities which have then helped us to update our pension scheme and will make a considerable difference. So yes, this is how we sort of think about the change. Can we have the next slide, please? I think they might not thank me for this photo, but it's really important to say that we're a people-based business. So everything, whilst governance does sit at the board table, it really is driven by the team. So people join us because of our purpose. We're also employee owned. So there's a built-in interest of colleagues about what we do and how we're going to do it. So it's back to the point that was mentioned earlier. We have quarterly meetings with everyone in the company to update on our progress. And for us, progress is not just finances. Yes, the money is important, but it's also the impacts around. So we report them all at the same time. How are we doing financially according to our goals, but how are we doing according to our environmental and social impacts too. We have a climate positive plan, which is publicly available on our website, but as part of, again, involving our team, we've been training everyone to become climate advocates, so they really understand and own and drive that forward. We give everybody volunteering hours so that not only they can go out and help others, but so they can bring learnings back into us and they can really help us with what we can do more. And we also have a collective process of everybody inputting into the annual impact report. The impact reports are also published on our website, so if it's ever helpful looking at any of those documents, feel free to browse around. We share them all because hopefully we can all learn from each other. I think the key thing is the team needs to ask the board difficult questions, and that's what it's all about. So if we could have the new slide, please. Boardroom 2030, I don't know how many of you have heard of this, but again, it's a B Corp initiated program linked into the pledge to be net zero by 2030, and it's happening around COP26, which is obviously ongoing at the moment. It's a good way of showing, I'd say, governance in action. The challenge from the B Corp community was, what should the boardroom look like in 2030? So we then, and it was up to us to interpret how to run an activity around that. We've actually given it to our senior team below us, not the board, to look at that, and then they've been working with everybody in the company. This week we've got an extraordinary board meeting. It's in a different location. We've got representatives, one from the senior team, one from the junior team coming along, and we're going to work with them, or they're leading us actually, to agree what we think success is going to look like by 2030, and then really importantly and interestingly, to build a new risk register that we will then use as a tracker to get that. So I think that's, again, it's about involving colleagues, you know, to shape and build the company from there. If we go next slide, please. We were asked to just think about some of the challenges and learnings of governance. And I think just to say, first of all, we're a small business. So one of the things you get asked to do is segregation of duties of the accounting function into people doing accounts payable and accounts owned. And we don't do that because of the size of the team. So automatically we're marked down on that. I think some of these things are just fixed. So that's interesting in that. It was mentioned before about impact reporting. Really important that that's robust and accurate. So we use external auditors for that process. One of those is linked into we also have 14,001 accreditation. So that gives us a lot of qualified metrics to use. And we work with another B Corp, actually, Green Element, to measure our broader impacts. So having trusted data to put into the impact reports is really key. I think it's really clear and maybe obvious, but it's much easier to measure carbon metrics than it is to measure social metrics. And I think that's an ongoing challenge and a time and a judgment call really for each of us to work out what we can spend time tracking and what we shouldn't, because again, as a small business, you can't spend your entire time measuring absolutely everything. So picking the things that are going to make the biggest impact has been really important for us, rather than worrying about the whole piece of it. And then, as I mentioned before, we have a climate positive plan, and in that we have pledged that by March 2022 we'll only be working with suppliers who've made a commitment to become net zero, and by April 2023 we'll only be working with clients who've publicly declared to tackle net zero as well. So it's really it's embedding it into us as an organisation. Actually, the challenge back then is updating our supplier screening and getting them to respond, and the sort of time it takes to do that. And actually, we're now getting to the point where we're probably going to have to change a couple of our quite major suppliers because they're not interested. So it's that constant thing about progress and check and challenge. Not everybody's on the same journey, but there's been some interesting successes through that by people changing their attitude, which is also quite nice. Next slide, please. And just a final one, because I was asked to give a top tip out of it. And my main tip would be don't keep B Corp measurement and decision making in the boardroom. I think it's about involving colleagues. It's about involving, for us, it's clients and our wider community in the process, because it will not only have business benefits, but it's also going to help shape and develop the processes to meet those standards. So it's a win-win on that point of thing. And so whilst governance sounds like it should only be the function of the board, I would suggest that governance is better achieved by involving others in that. There we go. Whistle stop tour, hopefully helpful.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Amanda. There was so many really great points in there, and definitely agree with kind of how you finished off there in terms of just involving everyone in the process, and not kind of keeping the B Corp certification journey something that's just kind of contained within the boardroom or a small team. And that's a great point to end on. I'm just going to check in the chat. I know a few questions have come in, and I know there was a question asked earlier by Julie. What is meant by material issues? So should we come back to you, Sung-Hyui, just to pick up on that one?
Sure. I mean, if Julie wouldn't mind joining a quick discussion, it would be great to get a little bit more background from you, Julie, and I'd be happy to explain further.
Yes, of course. There's a question, and I was trying to find it, but there's a question that says, based on the processes that you've already implemented, what are the material issues that you've identified? So what does that mean? What am I supposed to identify?
Is that in my bit of the presentation, or was that from an earlier bit?
No, it's actually in the B Corp in the B Corp assessment, sorry. So when you mentioned material issues, it actually triggered that. I thought, oh, well, I'll actually need to understand that question.
Nicole, I can help with that one if you like. Julie, so just talking about material issues, we would basically define that to be the key issues affecting your industry. So for example, it could be environmental or social. So just hypothetically, if you're a packaging company making cardboard packaging, then you might do what we call a materiality assessment, where you look at all of the potential material impacts that your business could have on environmental or social issues. And basically, after completing that assessment, you'd come out with the top issues that you should focus on as a business. So for example, a packaging company, it might be waste reduction, could be the material issue.
So like a SWOT analysis, but on social and environmental. Yeah,
exactly.
Perfect. I understand now. Thank you.
Good question though. Thank you.
Thanks, Daisy. Picking up on another question in the chat from Nick, in the Articles of Association, how specific does the wording need to be? Is there a set of words we must use? Yes, that's a great question. So we, in the slides that we'll share afterwards, we have a link that you can download to access the specific wording for the B Corp legal requirement. And that varies depending on the legal structure of the company. So there's a slightly different set of wording for a limited company, an LLP, a CLG, and different legal structures. So that's your best port of call for finding the right wording. Have seen some companies using the B Corp pending logo. At what point in the evaluation process can we start using this? Yeah, this is another question we get asked a lot, and it's always useful to just kind of make that distinction between pending B Corp and full B Corp. So pending B Corp is specifically for startup companies that have been operational for less than 12 months. So they don't go through the full B Corp certification process or go through that verification. It's specifically for those startup companies. So companies such as yourselves who have submitted to become fully certified B Corps, it's just not relevant for you. So yeah, our advice would be to wait until you're certified and then you can use the B Corp logo. Can we just add that wording and resubmit to Companies House? Does it need to be witnessed and signed off by a law firm? No, so some companies choose to work with law firms if that's something that you feel you would rather do, just to kind of have that legal support, but lots of companies do make the changes using internal resources that they have in the company, as long as you have that sign off internally from your board and any shareholders that you have. You need to have 75% of shareholders agree to the change.
And just to add to what Nicole was saying, so sometimes when we get involved is as Nicole says, when the company just wants like a second pair of eyes to double check that they put it in the right places. But also sometimes companies use the opportunity to include the UK legal test to then just change their articles a bit more and embed their purpose a little bit more in different ways. So, you know, we've seen companies who choose to include the responsible business principles at the back as an appendix to their kind of articles, or to flesh out a little bit more about, you know, asset locks or how profits are distributed, or just different ways of working. But as Nicole said, you don't have to have a law firm involved. We definitely don't have to like stamp it or anything like that before you submit it to Companies House.
And linked to that, Sung-Hyui, one question we get asked a lot is where in the article should you insert the amendment? What would your advice be on that? Yeah, so I think this links in quite nicely to the previous question we got from Nick about what the specific wording is. So Nick, I think in one of the slides, Nicole, I think there was a link to the UK legal test. So if you click on that, Nick, that actually tells you exactly what the language is that you need to put in to it. You have basically 3 or 4 key sets of changes. First of all, you change the objects clause, and you might have a specific objects clause or none at all. You don't really need to under UK law anymore. You would change that to make it the triple bottom line kind of commitment that we talked about before. And then what you would do is you would change the director's duty section to replace that with from the shareholders first, the triple bottom line language. And then the third kind of main change is the impact reporting requirement, and that wording slots in to the section of your articles that talks about what kind of reporting that you have to make under your article. So the UK legal test should give you, that document should give you some guidance, but if you've got any further questions, then you can let Nicole or Daisy or myself know if you've got any follow-up questions. Great. And yeah, I've just dropped that link in the chat function as well.
I have a question to build on that. Often we get asked about how to make the amendment if companies have model articles of association.
Yeah.
So just wondering if you could elaborate on that slightly, please.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the model articles are as simple as you get. And then what is actually more confusing is that if a company has incorporated using model articles in their incorporation form, you don't actually have the articles at the back. You just say this company has got model articles as a statement. So the first step you have to do is actually look up, just on Google is fine, is model articles company limited by shares. And then you actually go to the Government UK website, which has all the different sets of model articles. So you basically get the model articles first, and then you make the changes that I've just talked about. So to your objects, to your director's duties, and to your reporting.
Fantastic. Great. In our last 2 minutes, does anyone else have any other questions for Sung-Hyui or Amanda or myself and Daisy? Feel free to come off mute as well if there's anything that you'd like to ask.
I think people are keen to go for lunch, Nicole.
I think they are. I think they are. Well, we've nearly made it to the hour. So yes, thanks again, Amanda, Sung-Hyui. It's been really amazing to have you speak, and hopefully you've all enjoyed it, and it's been some useful inspiration and food for thought for continuing to improve in your impact in the governance section. So yeah, we're really grateful for your time, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Best of luck, everyone. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice afternoon.